more likely to be these kind of images. Images drawn from popular media that are probably the most likely images to come to mind. Now, these popular histories construct the past as much, if not more, than proper, i.e. professional history, the kind of history we usually find written in academic books. Now, of course, increasingly for many of us, images such as this may also spring to mind when thinking about World War II. Now, though games have dealt with World War II for a lot longer, the past 10 years have seen a large amount of such games. In fact, video games now deal with a wide variety of historical periods. For instance, here we can see Assassin's Creed 2, which is set in Renaissance Italy. Call of Duty 2, set during the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. And Total War Rome, which is set inspiredly in ancient Rome. And these historical games have the potential to be highly influential upon our popular cultural memory, the way we as a culture remember, the way we memorialize, explore, ask questions, and convey messages about the past. And these games are highly influential for a number of reasons, not the least of which, of course, is their huge sales. Historical games number amongst the top sellers in video games today. So for me as a historian, my interest lies in questions about what it means for history to be told through this new medium. And much of the work I've been doing is about carefully investigating how the video game form shapes the historical content. The way I see it, this is extremely important today when we see how many young people tend to lack a basic historical understanding. And just as in Britain, moving here to Sweden has made me realise that similar problems are faced throughout Europe. Investigating how digital games represent the past then, what they allow us to do and how they shape the history that they tell, is my whole intellectual project as an academic. So for this Nordic degree paper, I've engaged with World War I as a case study. Now when I set out to look at these games initially, I actually didn't think there was very many World War I games. So the working title was actually Nobody Plays in the Trenches. I was, however, quite wrong. I actually found 60 games that engaged with World War I, and these were games drawn from a variety of different gameplay genres. And this is without including World War I mods for other games, of which there are many. And the full list of the World War I games I found is included in the full paper. So I dived into these games, analysing them both in terms of their gameplay and their historical representations. And I was particularly interested in how they engaged with the popular memory of World War I. But what is the popular memory of World War I? Well, this is a powerful memory in much of Europe, as well as other parts of the world such as America and Canada. World War I memory is heavily concentrated on visual imagery. This is perhaps unsurprising given it was the first major European conflict where cameras were widely available to record the events that occurred. As many scholars have pointed out, by far the most common and evocative image of World War I popular memory is the Western Front trenches. The mud, the gas, the blood, the barbed wire, and the rats. And so this memory is really focused on the extreme material and psychological pressures troops faced in these trenches. So World War I is largely remembered in terms of personal experience, and this is evident in the popularity of war poetry, diaries, letters, and memoirs, particularly poetry by poets such as Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. Secondly, this image of the soldier in the trenches is combined with images of no man's land, images of the destruction of nature by man's folly, and of apocalyptic and hellish landscapes. Finally, the third part of this memory tends to revolve around images of memorialization, rows and rows of graves, images contextualized in national and religious symbolism, and the red poppy of Flanders fields. I realise that this is well known in Sweden, but in Britain, Canada, and some other countries around the world, Memorial Day is marked by the wearing of red poppies, which has become something that is extremely widespread now, with the proceeds going to various veterans' charities. So given the nature of World War I memory, then determining if a game engages with it revolves around the visual representation of the experience of frontline soldiers, alongside all or part of the imagery I've described here. And this is the criteria that I used when looking at World War I games to see if they engage with popular memory. So my interest was in games, how games represent this popular memory of World War I. But not in general. I wanted to look at this from a very specific angle. And that's from the perspective that World War I is actually a very contested event. The memory of it is very contested. There's still disagreement about what the conflict meant and what it was. And many different social groups argue over how it should be remembered. The disagreements about World War I are typical in academia. This also extends to more mainstream discourse as well. For example, recently in the newspapers in Britain, as the centenary of the war approaches, there have been a number of high-profile arguments about the true nature of World War I. These have been arguments between politicians, historians, journalists, and a range of other interested parties. But how does this relate to games? Well, Jonas Lindroth and I have found in previous research that games seem to generate controversy on the basis of two fears. Firstly, that they can seem to trivialize serious themes by simply including them in a game. Secondly, games seem to generate controversy because they can allow players to reenact historical episodes of abuse and violence. And this is key. There is a fear that certain playable positions are inappropriate because reenacting some historical actions in a game is seen as immoral. Thus, any controversial historical episode has to meet very specific conditions in order to be represented in games. And World War I is particularly difficult because the contested memory means that the morality of playing as particular historical characters is very unclear. To put it simply, there is no clear sense of who the good guys were in World War I. So what were my findings? Well, the first thing that's striking is that most of these games don't actually engage with World War I popular memory. Out of 60 games, only a third of them, 20 games, actually engage with this memory in any way. And this is obviously pretty strange. In most popular media, you would expect popular imagery and memory to be what is most strongly invoked. And yet, this is not the case in World War I games. So I decided to look a bit more deeply at these 20 games using Goffman's frame analysis, and found that there seems to be 5 ways that they use to negotiate the inclusion of this problematic popular memory. I've called these 5 frames the education frame, wargame frame, cartoon comic book frame, supernatural science fiction frame, and the history and memorial frame. So first of all, the education frame. Well, World War I games that are positioned within an educational frame are less likely to generate controversy for being tasteless, because the purpose of them is reframed as pedagogical. And this makes the potentially disrespectful play claim to only function as a vehicle for learning. And this refocuses on the historical content rather than the ludic activity. For example, let us look at trench warfare. Now this game is part of the BBC Schools website, which provides resources for formal education. And the game is placed alongside other resources for teaching about World War I. Players choose the weaponry and tactics for attacks and defences during World War I. They are then shown short animations of the ensuing combat, and finally informed in text as to the success of their attacks. Normally something like, you've made a gain of 1.25 miles, and this cost 15,000 men's lives. Despite being aimed at school children, the game includes topics such as shell shock, soldiers drowning in mud, and it even allows players to deploy the weapon frequently considered the most horrific of World War I, gas. It is difficult to see how outside the educational frame this would generally be encouraged, but the frame seems to negotiate any potential concerns about the children reenacting these episodes. Here, the tension between the game form and its controversial historical content is also purposely played with, and the desire for a learning outcome actually even eventually supersedes the typical concerns we would expect from trench warfare as a game. Thus, trench warfare questions players' victories after each level. It informs them of the later loss of all of the small gains that they made, and importantly, it has an impossible final mission. Here, players are informed that there is no way this battle was ever going to be a success, and ordering men to retry this mission would merely mean sending them to their deaths. Thus, trench warfare avoids any possibility of controversy by distancing it from its status as a game and focusing instead on its educational role. It therefore prevents players from treating it solely as a game. It breaks the adventure story typical to games in favour of the memory of World War I as a tragedy. And here the education frame handles any problems the setting creates. The second frame used by World War I games that include popular memory seems to be that of the war game. And tabletop war games have a history of use in military teaching and training, and they've long been associated with educational play and official memory. And the development of video games is intertwined with wargaming, and thus, as Sebastian de Terding argues, some video games can therefore be understood as remediations of older war games. The development of both forms of games are intertwined. In some World War I games of this kind, we still see soldiers in the trenches. These games still engage with popular memory. However, the tabletop perspective, the lack of a specific player character, the larger scale, and sometimes the turn-based structure all distance players from the violence and emotive tropes that generally characterize popular memory. Importantly, these design patterns also prevent players from actually committing any direct violence. They don't actually get to reenact the historical violence themselves. And this perhaps explains why violent video game moral panics have rarely been generated by, for instance, strategy games. Reframing in this way also, of course, associates these games with the history of war games, and war games are seen as something educational and something associated with official memory, and an appropriate way to represent and learn about war. Video games become associated with this history. And of course, importantly, this also shares the blame for any tastelessness that might be generated with a historical precedent. Perhaps the best example of this is Toy Soldiers, and this game embraces this framework very explicitly. In this game, we fight as an army of toy soldiers, and we fight against an army of toy soldiers, using toy vehicles and emplacements on a war game board, which clearly has hinges, painted scenic edges, and even the room beyond, which is completely visible. In a way, this framing is similar to the recent LEGO games, and these games use toys to represent characters from other franchises. By using the toys in this way, the violence of the games, or the original intellectual property that they're drawn from, is seen as suitable for children, because it's not people that are damaged, but the toy that represents them. The toy soldiers in the game, Toy Soldiers, are viewable in a display cabinet like war game miniatures, and they also break into little plastic pieces when they're killed. Loading screens show us the retail boxes for the toy units of the famous war game from Bothell, a fictional war game in which Toy Soldiers is set. This strong war game framing also perhaps explains why Toy Soldiers can so easily allow players to commit direct represented World War I mass slaughter and violence. Again, we can even directly use gas in this game, as you can see here. Perhaps this framing also explains why sequel Toy Soldiers Cold War can get away with representing the Vietnam War, also as a mass slaughter, and this is another controversial conflict. And this seems to be because using the war game frame negates much of the issues that controversial histories present. Similarly, the cartoon comic book frame seems to also negotiate much of these issues. Now, obviously, cartoon and comic book aesthetics distance themselves from the violence and horror of World War I by using a visual abstraction. But like the wargame frame, they also invoke older, more established and accepted frames. Even during World War I, cartoons were used politically, satirically, and for propaganda. And this has continued since the war. So for instance, here on the left, we see a cartoon which depicts Belgium as a small boy blocking the way of the Kaiser. And this is a contemporary World War I cartoon. On the right, we have a Charlie's War, a Pat Mills comic that depicts World War I, and this is a contemporary comic book. Now, these cartoon characters, or these comic book characters, constitute what Gotland called unnatural staged figures. And this means they're not imaginable as real people or played by real actors. And this, he argues, is likely to be managed by allowing them what he calls a wide variety of differential participation statuses. What does he mean by this? Well, he adds, as suggested, once the realm of the literally real is left, great license is to be expected. So these cartoon comic book figures in games may then be allowed more license and a fluid identity in the discourse of World War I. And they don't become as easily trapped by the expectations of the historical roles, which they still nonetheless represent. Certainly, cartoons have a long history of getting away with being irreverent. And historically, proving the malicious intent of images, given their inherent ambiguity compared to words, has made their prosecution very difficult. Additionally, whether due to similar reasons or a particular cultural and economic status, comics regularly deal explicitly in topics that are considered unusual and even appropriate for television and film. And if you're fans of the Walking Dead comic book, but this is something you might have noticed, the TV series is rather tame by comparison to the comic, because, let's be honest, a lot of the stuff never get broadcast on network TV in America. So the conditions in each form seem to be different. Thus, games using this cartoon framing seem to combine the license of unnatural stage figures, as described by Kaufman, with a strong and present history of cartoon satire. And this also meets a history of satirizing the tragic futility of World War I in other forms. For example, in Blackadder Goes Forth, the comedy TV series, which was set during World War I. And irony and satire have been a part of World War I discourse since the conflict itself, and even during the conflict. Perhaps then these games can engage World War I popular memory, because we already expect them to deal with serious subjects in a way that suspends the normal rules of what is appropriate, as cued by the cartoon or comic book aesthetic. Thus here, the tension between the game form and the historical content is turned into an expression in its own right. For example, Super Trench Attack, which describes itself as action parody and a goofball shooter based on the folly of World War I on its website, embraces the satirical framing in a way that is completely explicit. As Priestman, a reviewer for Indie Static, put it, rather than being historically accurate, or exploring the grim realities of trench warfare during World War I, Super Trench Attack is the vision of war a soldier would have probably conjured in their head before signing up. And this game really runs with this idea. It constructs the image of the war found in recruitment posters rather than the actuality of World War I, and it's therefore filled with bravery, masculinity, and seductive female images. By ironically contrasting with World War I popular memory, this creates what Priestman calls an indulgent parody of male lust and stupidity. Thus, the satirical frame implied by the cartoon style protects the game from criticism on the basis of it not being serious enough, because this is clearly not the point of this game. And this is a common framing of World War I that has historical precedent. Valiant Hearts developers make a similar move when they state that the storyline, which is about love, loss, and the futility of war, is obviously on the downbeat side, as it should be. But Valiant Hearts' cartoonish style will allow for plenty of comedy to offset the inescapable tragedy. This satirical approach is again justified by invoking historical precedents, and the developers go on to talk about Blackadder Goes Forth, and in particular, the use of satire during World War I, even on the battlefield. And they add, it's something that the comic book styling allowed us to do as well, was to characterize the stereotypes and play with that in a humorous fashion when we're talking about a very dark subject. Here, they invoke both the power of unnatural stage figures, of cartoons, their fluid identity, and of course the power of satire itself. That this is done completely consciously is emphasized by the developers when they state, we get away with a lot more. And keeping it fun, there's a game within the story, and the comic book style lends itself very well to that. It's clear that both the use of cartoon and comic book aesthetics give a certain leeway to developers that might be useful for dealing with potentially controversial subjects such as World War I. The fourth frame that I found World War I games that engaged with popular memory seem to use was what I've called the supernatural or science fiction frame. And this is where a supernatural or science fiction layer is added to the fictional world that is created. Esther McCallum Stewart calls these representations Elseworlds, and these are worlds where everything is the same as the reality that we're used to living in, except for one core facet. And for instance, these are superhero films, the Twilight franchise, True Blood, normal everyday life with a core facet that's changed. McCallum Stewart notes how media has moved towards these representations after 9/11. And this is because they easily provide answers to moral questions about good and evil that representations of reality, or for instance warfare, might struggle with in the more unclear moral landscape. And this has the same effect in World War I games, because it reframes the player's actions as a morally clear conflict, a fight between good and evil, instead of a morally unclear and pointless slaughter. So accordingly, in Call of Cthulhu, The Wasted Land, players are told that the war we are really fighting is not against the Germans, or the Central Powers, but is against the cult of the Awakened, a secret occult society hidden within the German army, and with its own sinister agenda. Similarly, in Necrovision, the enemy is not so much the German forces, but the demonic forces of hell themselves. And in the World War I levels of the darkness, while the enemies wear German uniforms, they are actually demonic servants of the titular darkness. In each case, the events of the game are reframed by using religious and occult tropes, and this changes the game's representation from a futile and morally controversial contest between earthly nations to a quest to save the world from evil. Again, this framing has historical precedents. Literary scholars Paul Fussell and Northrop Frye know how images of the demonic and of hell are commonplace in World War I literature during and after the conflict. Science fiction themes can also be used to achieve a similar reframing. For example, in the Unbekannte Krieg, you have to excuse my German, the fight is recast as a matter of survival as we try to survive the attacks of a dinosaur instead of enemy soldiers. And in the darkest of days, the player character is a time traveller tasked with preserving the timeline against evil time bandits. The only enemies the player is encouraged to shoot, except for those soldiers that died during the original events anyway. And thus the player is tasked with actually preserving the memory of World War I. In both cases, the morality of the violence in the playable position is reframed as something that is necessary and justifiable, unlike the typically uncertain moral violence of World War I as is commonly understood. The final frame is what I have called the history and memorial frame, and this is used a lot to negotiate any issues with World War I popular memory in games. And this basically can be understood as a frame that simply claims historical accuracy as justification for including these themes. And this framing works on the idea that topics, even controversial ones, are not chosen, but are simply found, and that the developers therefore have a duty to include them. And this hides the role of the developer in making decisions about what is included in the history. This is something that's done when constructing a history in any form. Naturally then, this framing rests on the notion that these games are very authentic and that they're serious histories, and that they're distanced from their status as a game. Thus, even Valiant Hearts, despite its cartoonish style, emphasizes its authenticity, and its promotional materials show us artifacts, photographs, documents, and postcards that have inspired designers. The game is described as absolutely rooted in reality. Similarly, the promotional webpage for World War I first-person shooter Verdun emphasizes the game's authenticity, stating that players will get to use authentic weapons, models from real-world examples, to experience true trench warfare, and that the developers have done extensive research in the field and are advised by experienced historians to make the game as true to historical facts as possible. Its competitor, The Song, which is as yet unreleased, also claims to attempt to achieve a level of realism to symbolize the horrors that brave soldiers had to live in, emphasizes its realistic weapons with accurate animations and even the correct posture of the player character. When combined with World War I, this history framing, this claim to serious authenticity, almost inevitably becomes tangled in the discourse of memorialization. And there is a sense that there is a moral duty to remember and to witness the war. And this sense of memorial infuses most World War I games that use the history frame, but is particularly explicit in The Song with its subtitle, Lest We Forget, and the banner on the website which proclaims, "People are machines of forgetfulness," a quote by Henry Robbins. Similarly, the developers of Valiant Hearts emphasize this memorial duty to World War I, stating in an interview that we want to remind, to tell the young generation what happened during that period of time. Now, this memorial framing seems to be pretty powerful. It negotiates all the issues of World War I popular memory within the game form. The history frame infers that developers can't help allowing players to do controversial things, because that's just how the past was. The memorial aspect adds a further emphasis on this duty to authenticity, and to witness the events by making the game in the first place. In this way, playing with these games, and indeed even creating these games, is recast as a service to historical truth. In a similar move to Darkest of Days, the player and developer are cast as playing and creating, respectively, simply to protect the memory of World War I. So, conclusions. Firstly, unlike most popular histories, the majority of World War I games don't engage with World War I popular memory. This does also have a particular positive aspect, and it means that games, unlike most forms, often include elements of World War I that are usually absent from popular culture, such as naval warfare, or in the grand strategy games, national or global economic, industrial, political, diplomatic, and military systems. As a teacher argued recently in the Guardian newspaper, normally in popular culture, the war is not envisaged as a point where international tensions peaked, of the rivalries of European powers, or the building of alliances. It is only seen through the prisms of suffering. However, within games, the reverse seems to be true. Games often engage with these things, but they less often engage with the World War I popular memory that other popular culture focuses on. Now, this avoidance of World War I popular memory may be because this memory runs the risk of being perceived as tasteless when included in a game. And again, this is generated on two fears: the serious theme being treated less seriously than it should, and the concern of allowing players to reenact immoral historical actions. These are particular problems in regards to World War I because the contested memory of the war makes the morality of particular positions unclear and uncertain. Thus, World War I games seem to use the 5 frames that I have described here. Importantly, both of these framings rely on historical precedent. They use known ways of representing World War I and recycle tropes from other media. And this seems to help establish their legitimacy in engaging World War I popular memory. And of course, it shares the blame. This analysis not only describes between the relationship between World War I and video games, but also the nature of video games as a historical form. The medium often has, obviously has positive possibilities that I've written about extensively elsewhere, but it also clearly has formal and cultural limits. It is also clear, however, that these limits and negotiations have created a space for creative engagements with the past, as developers have negotiated them. Finally, this analysis emphasises the pressure that history always places on the present, and of course vice versa. As Ross Wilson knows, this is particularly the case with World War I memory because of its obvious ideological and political utility and value. This, Wilson argues, means that World War I will remain a presence in culture, and each generation will continue to have the opportunity to return to the trenches to locate meaning, relevance, and understanding. In this respect, he argues the Great War is not over. In the sense that in video games, World War I memory is clearly in play, played with and played within, perhaps this newest of historical forms emphasises that the Great War is not yet over, and perhaps more starkly than any other form. Before I finish, I'd just like to take the opportunity to also say, if there are any PhD students, or you know any PhD students that might be interested in historical games, I will be running a doctoral course for PhD students, 2 3-day sessions and an online meeting on the topic of historical games, which looks at a number of strands, games as text, informal education, players, modders and their online activities, and historical games design. And students are reimbursed for travel and hotel costs for this course, so if anybody's interested, then please do let me know. Thank you very much for listening to me.